The sub-prefect recognized the emperor and gave him the best reception that lay in his power. His wife and sister, two pretty Polish girls, were thrilled with excitement at having His Majesty under their roof, and were delighted beyond measure at seeing him in good health. No physiognomy is so expressive as the Polish. The emperor appreciated the warmth of his reception, but had so much business on hand that there was no opportunity for chatting with the ladies or the sub-prefect. And he employed his time in dictating orders for the Duke of Bassano and for Warsaw. He instructed his minister to hurry on the levies and the arming of the duchy, informing Marais of what he had granted the Poles, and ordering him to send a fresh courier to Vienna and to Prince Schwarzenberg. He also issued orders to Lauriston, who was to go to Warsaw, instructing him to remain there, to assume command of the entire army, to arm Modlin and Siroc. To General Dutais, whom he had seen at Warsaw, he confirmed in writing the orders he had given him verbally, that he was to keep all the troops passing through the city, and to organize and arm the National Guard. The emperor grew impatient with my slow writing, my fingers being still numb with cold, and decided to write himself, while I made drafts of what he had already dictated. But his own fingers were stiff. His handwriting was at best illegible, and after writing 2 letters which he could not even read himself, he was obliged to dictate fresh ones to me. Dinner put a stop to this correspondence. I preserved the 2 historic letters written in the emperor's own hand and sent off the dispatches while he dined. By this time the sledge was repaired. His Majesty barely took time to eat. I managed to snatch a piece of bread, with which to make my meal, as we went on our way. The emperor was deeply touched by the reception he had met with at Kutno, and instructed me to tell Duroc, when we arrived in Paris, to send a gift to the sub-prefect's wife. During the journey from Warsaw to Kutno, the emperor had spoken of England, of the difficulty of forcing her to make peace, unless some financial crisis or internal embarrassment forced the hands of the cabinet. At the moment, he seemed to regret that his idea for the restoration of Poland had embroiled him with Russia. He agreed that she was of great importance in the continental system. Rumyantsev, he went on, was aware how advantageous this alliance would be to me. He was no genius, but he was a man of sound judgment, with a thorough understanding of the European situation as it developed after Tilsit, and as we envisaged it at Erfurt. He also realized so fully the advantages we should draw from the alliance in France's relation to England, that he would not even believe in hostilities until we had crossed the Niemen. He always doubted my real intention of attacking Russia. He thought my object was to make them shut their eyes to what had happened, and that my hostile demonstrations were only to force Russia not to receive neutrals and to consider herself fortunate that I had stopped at threats. I could not permit this admission of pretended neutrals, the emperor continued, as it furnished the English with a means of eluding the continental blockade. But I would have passed it over, and we should have reached an understanding if I had been able to entertain any hope of persuading the Tsar Alexander to organize a great expedition on India. At the point we had reached in our struggle with England, whose cabinet was staking its all, this would have been the only way of alarming the London merchants. The nation would have forced the government to treat for peace. But after Erfurt, I felt suspicion in the air. For my part, affairs in Spain were more or less spoiling my other projects. Alexander and Rumyantsev did not incline so much as I had expected to the partition of Turkey, and thus all my plans made at Tilsit had to be modified. I may be obliged to look at things from another angle. By some means or other, we must get out of the rut we are in, find some means of forcing England to make peace, weaken Russia, solve the problem of Europe by creating a great buffer state. It would be a splendid and noble thing to rob England of any hope of forming a new coalition by sapping the strength of the only great power which could still be her ally. The emperor told me that he had long thought that Constantinople was coveted by Russia. In the hope of an expedition, or at least a demonstration against India, he had planned another expedition by sea, possibly independent of the land operation, to which he would have been able to furnish a strong contingent if he could have persuaded the Russians to allow a French corps to march through their country. But from what he knew, and from what the Tsar and Rumyantsev had told him, this would have been difficult to negotiate. The emperor appears to have planned his expedition against India in the following manner. He had obtained from the navy all the necessary information. It seemed to him that the main obstacle was the impossibility of carrying sufficient water for 25 or 30,000 men for such a long voyage. Otherwise, he had found no insuperable difficulty. He would have directed the expedition against Surat, a landing to be made at some point on the Maratha coast, where the people were natural enemies of the English and ready at any moment to take up arms against them. The expeditionary force would have been 30,000 strong. They would put in at only one port, Mauritius, to water and take on board provisions and leave their sick. These latter would have been replaced by 2,000 or 3,000 Negroes for whom the colonists would be paid in ready money. France, the Empress, and the King of Rome were subjects of daily conversation. His Majesty never wearied of exclaiming how glad he would be to see them again, and expressed the most tender affection for them. The Empress he praised constantly, talking of his home life with a feeling and a simplicity that did one good to hear. Of France and the French, he spoke with an enthusiasm that was consoling after so many sacrifices. "I make myself out to be worse than I really am," he said to me laughingly, "for I have observed that the French are always ready to eat out of one's hand. They lack seriousness. Consequently, that quality impresses them most. I am supposed to be severe, even hard. So much the better. It saves me from having to be so. My firmness passes for insensibility, and it is partly to this impression that we owe the existing state of good order, although the revolution is so recent, and although we have a generation among us reared in disorder with no conception of morality or religion. So I do not complain of my reputation. Believe me, Caulaincourt, I'm only human. Whatever some people may say, I have a tender heart, but it is the heart of his sovereign. The tears of a duchess move me to no pity whatsoever, but I am touched by the woes of peoples. I want to see them happy, and the French shall be so. If I live 10 years, there will be contentment everywhere. Don't you suppose I enjoy giving pleasure? It does me good to see a happy face, but I'm compelled to defend myself against this natural disposition, lest advantage be taken of it. I found that out more than once with Josephine, who was always begging me for things, and could even cry me into granting what I ought to have refused her. The emperor often asked me if I too should not be delighted to see my loved ones again. This good and natural manifestation of His Majesty's real feelings refreshed me more than I can say. I should have liked the ears of all Europe to hear his words, and every echo to repeat them. I am positive that I lost not one syllable of this conversation, which I would gladly have prolonged indefinitely. The emperor was most anxious to meet his couriers in order to get the eagerly awaited letters from France. The first we had received since Smargoni. He accordingly hastened our journey as much as he could. At Posen, we would regain the road the army had taken on its way to Königsberg. Meanwhile, the emperor reviewed his cabinet. He praised Arch-Chancellor Cambaceres as a man of prudent counsel and a great lawyer. His equitable and singularly clear judgment had thrown much light upon several articles in the code, notably those presenting the greatest difficulties. Alluding to the death of the king, only fear, he said, prevented him from voting his acquittal. Cambaceres, he added, was far from being a revolutionary. He was a man worthy of confidence and incapable of abusing it. He had always made the best use of the trust given him. His high repute was most justly acquired. The emperor cited the Duke of Rovigo as a man entirely devoted to him, a man of strong character and independent viewpoint. He had a kind heart, he said. He was thoroughly good-natured, even obliging. He would often have been duped if the emperor had not stopped him. But he was too self-interested, and this displeased his majesty, who had decided to deprive him of the gaming monopoly, for he was incessantly asking for money, although he had already been given large sums, and his fortune, since he became a minister, had risen to 5 or 6 millions. As for the rest, the public was unjust in its opinions of him. It was held up against him that he had been present at the execution of the Duke of Enghien. But, he added, he had received orders to attend the execution, and being commandant of the picked gendarmerie, it was his duty to be there. Anybody else would have obeyed orders exactly as he did. He was a much better man, much less of an inquisitor than Fouché. It is now the fashion to laugh at Savary. It was indeed ridiculous that a divisional minister, the minister of police, should be taken from his bed and whisked off to jail by a madman just escaped from a lunatic asylum. This Malay incident very naturally made all Paris roar with laughter, and ridicule is more fatal to those in authority than their mistakes.